postcard from the night, addressed to you. The sky is unhurried, a soft slate scattered with patient sparks, and somewhere within it a small traveller lifts a faint veil, while a far giant turns in the cold. I am here beside you, voice low, to keep watch while you rest. We won't rush. We'll let the eyes and the breath find the same slow tempo, like waves that choose a shore and then linger there. There is the hush of a telescope dome, the quiet click of a shutter, the long, steady gathering of light that feels almost like listening. If you're settling under a blanket, ease your shoulders down. If your thoughts still hum, let them idle at the curb for a while. I'll guide us through what's truly seen and what is only a gentle hunch, speaking plainly, never loud. If you like, slip on headphones or set your phone to do not disturb so the outside world can wait. You're safe to close your eyes. If sleep arrives mid-sentence, that is welcome. I'll keep reading, and the story will take care of itself. There's a playlist of these night lessons when you want more, and a small circle of listeners who drift here often. You're invited, softly, whenever it suits you. Now, breathe in the cool of imaginary starlight, and breathe out the day. Somewhere ahead, a pale halo brightens, and far beyond, a slow mountain breathes in the dark. We will move at the pace of the light we gather, and that is enough. A still frame first. Imagine the night paused like a photograph, the scene held between breaths. In the center, a dim bloom floats, neither sharp star nor broad cloud, but a soft wreath of light, as if a lantern were muffled in gauze. I linger with you at that small glow, letting the pupils widen, letting the shoulders drop. The field around it is a salt spray of stars, each a pin on the fabric, and near the glow a faint brightening leans toward the sun, not away from it. We meet the quiet halo before we name it, because names can hurry the mind, and tonight we are unhurried. I describe only what the eye can keep, a core that is brighter than its veil, a tail that streams back as expected, and ahead of the core, a narrow shard, like a lantern's beam cutting forward through mist. We do not rush to meanings. We simply look. There is a patience to these images that belongs to long nights and steady hands. One exposure is never the whole story. Many must be coaxed into one. Imagine coaxing is a kind of listening. You gather little syllables of light and stack them until a sentence appears. In the combined frame, the halo rounds itself into a more honest circle. The backward flowing tail strengthens, and the narrow forward streak stands there, persistent, as if it had been waiting for you to notice. The mind tries to jump ahead. Is it a jet, a trick, a digital mirage? Let that jump land softly. We will give the picture the courtesy of time. We will let signal and doubt sit together for a while, until the conversation between them grows gentle. That is how the small truths of the sky prefer to arrive. Step closer with me to the conditions that make such seeing possible. The air must be steady enough that stars do not boil. The mount must hum like a metronome. The sensor must be kept cool, quiet, and faithful. There is a rhythm to it. Expose, dither, correct, repeat, and then, later, the quiet chores. Subtract the darkness that the camera carries, divide by the flatted field, align the whispering smudges that are not stars. If a breeze touches the tripod, you wait. If a thin cloud walks across the field, you wait again. In that waiting, the night teaches a kind of courtesy. Do only what helps the halo show its shape, and refuse the urge to push harder than the data wants. The halo rewards restraint. Now, about geometry. The textbook picture in your memory insists that a tail should stream away from the sun, and in this frame it does, a soft pennant in the solar wind. But the narrow forward streak ahead of the core asks for a second picture, and we borrow one from a lamp on a winter road. The lamp's glass glows all around, the beam throws forward where a vent opens, and behind it drifts a braided scarf of breath. A small body can vent in many directions at once. Sunlight turns on and off across its surface. Rotation brings a jet to face the day and then draws it back into night, so that over many minutes and hours, a slender spear of brightness can appear to stand in front like a pointer, while the longer dust stream trails behind. The eye takes in both at once, and the mind lets them sit together without hurry. If you're wondering why someone at a quiet backyard pier might catch this before a larger mirror does, the answer is simply cadence and attention. Professional surveys sweep great swaths of sky with wonderful regularity, but they are built for breadth. A patient observer who can return to the same faint guessed night after night, who is free to spend many small exposures on one patch and to coax them into a single patient frame, may notice a feature that would be averaged away in a wider program. It is not a contest, only a duet. The surveys find, the watchful refine, the watchful alert, the surveys confirm, and between them a ledger of light is kept. This is how a lantern in the distance becomes more than a rumour. This is how a quiet halo acquires character. Let's take a minute for stillness. Hear the soft electric tick of the drive, steady as a clock in another room. A faint breeze combs dry grass. Somewhere a nightbird writes a single note on the air and then thinks better of a second. The glow at the center does not hurry you, it keeps its slow breathing. Close the eyes if they ask to close. The picture is already inside them. Glow, tail, forward shard, like a small scene remembered from a winter walk. The body can learn this tempo, and the mind can let it. Nothing urgent is being demanded. The lantern burns without needing more oil. Oddities and comets are, themselves, ordinary. A veil can knot into streamers, a jet can bloom on the dayside and fade on the night. Dust sizes change with time and distance. A rotation that was once steady can be tugged by its own breath. If you could line up a century of images on a wall, you would see a gallery of variations that teach the same humble lesson. Variety does not mean violation. And yet the eye is right to pause over a feature that points the wrong way, because the wrong way is how we find new balances in familiar physics. A jet that appears to lead the motion may be telling a simple story about sunlight, spin, and small pores opening in a crust, but it could also be whispering about a sharper vent than usual. A seam that focuses the outflow so that it draws a bright line on the sky for a while before softening again. And we are allowed to be curious without being certain. So we'll keep watch. We will let more nights pile their quiet on the stack, and we will treat each new frame as a letter from a traveller who writes slowly but honestly. If the forward streak persists, we will listen to that persistence. If it wavers, we will listen to the wavering. There is no need to decide before the data have finished their say. For now, it is enough to have found a lantern in the dark and to notice how its glass glows and how its beam noses forward into the cold. The quiet halo is our companion, the field a page, and our work is simply to read. That is all. What makes a frame feel real in the dark? Is it the first glance, the grainy scatter of stars and the shy smudge that could be anything? Or the patient proof that gathers when we open the image like a careful notebook? I think of the raw files as the night speaking plainly. They arrive as rectangles of numbers, fits headers listing time in UTC, sensor temperature, exposure length, gain, and the position of the mount as it followed a path across the sky. Before any beauty, there are chores. The bias frames that catch the camera's own faint heartbeat, the dark frames that learn its quiet thermal whisper, the flats that even out the field where dust or vignetting can pretend to be the cosmos. Only after that housekeeping do we allow ourselves to look again. The page is cleaner now. The guest is still faint, but it stands a little straighter. There are two ways to let a night sky move through a camera. One way is to hold still on the stars. We call that sidereal tracking, and it makes the stars crisp while anything drifting differently, like a comet, turns into a slender blur, a seed blown by wind across the sensor. The other way is to follow the traveler, to nudge the mount so its clockwork matches the object's motion, or to gather many short frames and later align them on the comet itself. In that comet-locked stack, the stars become streaks that confess our trick, and the faint thing at center firms into a steadier glow. The contrast is gentle but decisive, streaks that tell of a sky we chose to ignore, and a small presence that stays, like a candle, protected by a cupped hand. Even then, subtle structure hides inside the glow. Astronomers sometimes use a rotational gradient, the Larson Sekanina method, to coax it into view. Imagine making two softened copies of the same image, each one rotated by a small angle around the center, and then comparing them so that uniform haze cancels but radial changes remain. It is not sorcery. It is a way of asking, quietly, where the brightness changes fastest as you sweep around the nucleus. Jets, fans, and asymmetries respond to that question with little arrows of contrast. If you have ever run a fingertip over a frosted window to find the groove of a hidden etching, you already know the feeling. A pattern you couldn't see a moment ago is suddenly present, modest, but sure enough to invite another look. Across nights, the test grows stronger. If you stack 20 60-second frames tonight, and 20 tomorrow, and 20 the next, and each time a tiny bright point nests in the same place at the heart of the haze, you start to learn its manners. Perhaps the forward-leaning streak wavers a few degrees as geometry shifts. Perhaps the tail's edge feathers more on one side than the other. Yet the core, that compact ember, keeps returning to the same seat no matter how the stars slide by, no matter how the guiding errors twitch, and that persistence is the quiet grammar of reality, speaking in a soft voice that carries farther than you'd expect when you listened with care and give it time to finish its thought. We circle dates on a calendar and place them beside these frames. The habit itself becomes a kind of lens. Signal and noise share a room, but they behave differently. Noise fidgets. It appears as peppered specks that shift when you restack, as faint mottling that refuses to hold a shape, as single pixel sparks from a cosmic ray that vanish when you median combine. Signal is patient. It adds the way steady steps add distance. Stack n similar frames, and the meaningful parts rise roughly n times, while the restlessness grows only as the square root of n. That is why an hour of small exposures can whisper louder than a single long stare. It is also why restraint matters. If you sharpen too hard or stretch too far, you may amplify the fidgets until they impersonate a feature. Better to let the math do the lifting and keep the touch kind. This is also why careful voices say, may. A processed frame that reveals a compact point at center invites the word is, but the experienced hand pauses. Were the bias and dark libraries matched in temperature? Was the flat field recent enough to reflect a new dust mote? Did a satellite leave a graze of light that a median failed to erase? Or did thin cloud play tricks with gradients that the gradient removal only partly undid? And, quietly but always, did we choose our parameters because they made the object look the way we hoped? The way through is simple, and it is slow. Repeat with different settings. Repeat with different nights. Repeat on another telescope with a cousin sensor. And then ask a friend across an ocean to try. A phrase like may show is not a hedge to hide behind. It is a promise to keep testing until the picture can stand without our hands on it. And it is a kindness to the future reader who will build on what we leave. So we keep a logbook. The date, the UT start and end, the air temperature, seeing and transparency, the exposure count, and how many we kept, the calibrations used, the alignment choice, the processing steps in order with their modest numbers. We store the raw frames and the calibration files beside the finished image, so that another person can rebuild the night from its parts. We tag the results with the object's motion, the phase angle, and the position angle of the tail and any sunward feature we think we see. We send a quiet note to a friend who has watched longer than we have. What we are really building is not a single beautiful picture, but a small archive with a reliable spine. When the day asks what was real in the dark, we will have something gentle and sturdy to show. And for tonight, we allow the room to dim around that thought until it, too, fades to quiet. Evidence is the slow grammar of light. We speak it by habit when we work at the eyepiece or the keyboard. But tonight, we will name its parts and feel how each one steadies the hand. An image is a sentence. A night's run is a paragraph. A season of observations is a chapter. And together, they make a ledger that does not shout, it accumulates. The sky offers hints, then repeats them with small changes. We answer by stacking, by measuring, by asking other mirrors to look. In that back and forth, patterns either hold or they soften and drift away. The point is not to win an argument. It is to write clearly enough that someone far from here, on another hill and another month, can read our page and find the same quiet meaning. That is what makes a claim feel earned. Start with the bones of a record. Times in coordinated universal time, exposure lengths, sensor temperatures, filters, plate solutions, and uncertainties that do not pretend to be smaller than they are. A field measured against known stars, with residuals that tell us how well the model fits. If we claim a brightening, we carry the photometric path that led there. The comparison stars, the catalogue, the aperture choices, and the steps we took to keep moonlight or thin cloud from leaning on the result. If we claim a shape, we show the sequence that reveals it. The raw, the calibrated, the object-locked stack, the gentle processing, and at least one alternate reduction that reaches. The same sign. Even on a quiet night, this is how a sentence earns its verbs. Without the bones, a picture is only a mood. With them, it becomes a measurement. Next comes independence. A single careful run can propose an idea. Only a second, differently made, begins to test it. Another latitude, another telescope, another sensor family, another processing path that does not share our assumptions. These are not luxuries. They are the air acclaim breathes. If a sunward streak appears in a dozen frames from our yard, we ask a friend under another sky to try. If they find nothing, we search our own chain for the weak link. If they find the same angled thread, we look for shared systematics before we relax into belief. We repeat on a later date when the geometry has changed by a few degrees, because a true structure will drift in a lawful way, as the sun, earth, and traveller rearrange their angles. This is not suspicion. It is courtesy to the truth we hope to share. Cross-checks give that courtesy a place to live. In the world of small bodies, there are channels where measurements go to be weighed against one another. Clearinghouses that publish orbit solutions tied to specific epochs, that log astrometry with known cameras and known observatories, that annotate residuals when a point lies a little off the fit, and that revise elements when fresh data arrive from a new night or a new station. So an object's path is not a proclamation, but a living estimate that gets better as the ledger thickens and the seasons turn. Around those solutions gather the notes of spectroscopists, the reports of photometrists, and the quiet posts from backyard observers who attach their calibration files so a stranger can rebuild the night from the parts. When a feature survives that kind of company, it has begun to speak in the voice of the sky, not ours. Language matters. We have a ladder of phrases for what we think we see, and it keeps us honest. May show invites replication, consistent with admits neighbours in idea space. Evidence for says that several lines now point the same way. Detection of is saved for the moment when alternatives have been tested and failed. Between those rungs we place the numbers, a position angle with an uncertainty, a brightness change with an error bar, a time span during which a feature was present, and we resist the urge to decorate them with certainty they cannot yet bear. There is also a question of venue. A quick image can live on a community board, a measurement belongs in a circular, or a note where methods travel with the claim. A broader synthesis waits until others have had their say. None of this slows the sky. It only slows our adjectives. Negatives deserve ink. We have all looked for a rumoured jet and found only quiet haze, or chased a reported outburst and met a normal night. Those pages still strengthen the ledger because they fence a claim with context. A null from a different instrument tells us something about contrast limits. A non-detection on a windy night reminds us how seeing smears structure flat. A careful not seen at a later phase angle tells us a feature was transient, not structural. It is tempting to publish only the yes to keep the no in a drawer. But the ledger grows truer when the blanks are inked, because they keep our curve from bending toward wish. And when the hoped-for sign finally appears, we know it better for having traced the outline of its absence. The quiet work of not finding is part of finding. Patience is the tempo that lets all of this breathe. A season is long, the moon cycles through its own bright moods. Weather has opinions. Instruments need care. People get tired. And still, the sky keeps its steady practice of returning the same objects, a little closer, a little farther, a little brighter, a little dimmer, inviting us to measure the differences without hurrying the meaning, to accept that some lines in the ledger will stop after a few words while others will run for pages, and to remember that most of what we do is tend the garden in which conclusions will later grow, rather than plucking conclusions themselves before they have formed, because a harvest taken too soon is thin, and a harvest allowed to ripen is sweet and sure in the hand. We can make room for that kind of time. So when we say we have evidence, we mean that these layers now sit together without strain. Documented bones, independent looks, lawful geometry, cross-checked channels, language that fits the weight of the numbers, and the honesty of blanks kept beside the marks. The ledger is steady enough to lean on, not because it is complete, but because it is consistent. I turn an imaginary dimmer in my mind and let the room ease one notch softer. The page we've written glows just enough to read. The rest of the night recedes to a kind grey. We will add to this tomorrow and the day after, a line at a time, and the meaning will thicken as quietly as dew on a rail. For now, we close the cover gently and let the brightness fall. I remember a thin shard of light that refused to behave. Years ago, a speck came in from the dark between stars and glinted like a sliver of metal in surf. We learned its name later, but at first it was only a stubborn brightness that rose and fell as it spun, a lighthouse beam that wouldn't find a steady rhythm. The curve of that brightening, up, down, up again, told us the body was not round and not calm. It tumbled end over end, so that one moment a broad face met the sun, and the next a narrow edge slipped past, and the whole thing flashed like a shard twisting in water. No fuzz of a normal coma wrapped it, no generous tail trailed behind. It was simply there, shard bright and private, and then it was past, leaving us with a handful of careful measurements and a long breath of wondering. In the months that followed, that shard did something subtler still. Its path curved a little more than gravity alone could explain, as if a gentle hand pressed against it from the sun's side. The numbers for that extra nudge were small, but insistent, the kind that survive when you subtract every known pull and still find a remainder that doesn't go away. We know comets can push themselves when warm faces hiss into space, trading gas for momentum in tiny exchanges. But the shard offered no obvious vapor, no cloud we could weigh and blame. So papers were written that tried on possibilities, the way sailors check a breeze with raised fingers. Perhaps faint outgassing too dilute to see. Perhaps sunlight itself pushing on an unusually thin body. Perhaps ices that evaporate without leaving easy traces. Perhaps a blend of all three. The tone stayed careful. The result stayed the same. A traveller from elsewhere had twitched under a force we could not fully itemize. Another messenger arrived 2 years later and answered with familiarity. This one wore a proper veil, a coma soft as breath, and pulled a long tail behind like gauze drawn through dark water. It brightened on the inward leg, shed dust, showed a nucleus concealed in mist, and behaved the way a textbook would hope. A comet, but one that never belonged to our sun until now. Spectra spoke in known lines, the fingerprints of simple molecules we have learned to recognize in our own Oort cloud visitors. Through large mirrors, the coma resolved into structure, and through small ones, it was simply beautiful. If the shard had been a riddle, this was a comfortable letter in a familiar hand, posted from another neighborhood in the same great city of stars. The comfort mattered. It told us that Interstellar did not have to mean unknowable. The contrast between those two travelers taught a soft lesson about categories. One was dry-faced or tightly skinned, throwing no obvious vapor and yet feeling a push. The other was dusty and sure, with gas and grains that flared when warmed, its chemistry rhyme and meter easy to pass. In the first, we saw light that rose and fell by factors as it tumbled, so quickly that models could fit either an elongated bar or a flattened wafer depending on assumptions, both strange in their own ways. In the second, we saw the confident signature of a small icy body doing what small icy bodies do when they cross into sunlight after a long cold voyage. The lines in the spectrum ringing the same notes we have heard before. It is hard not to love a pair like that for the way they bracket a category, one at the edge of our sense, the other in the middle of our map. Between them, a space opens where learning can happen. Take a breath with me while the instruments rest. The room dims by a notch as if a cloud has slid across the moon. A kettle on a far counter clicks as it cools. Night air presses lightly on the window pane and lifts again, as if counting. Somewhere outside, a branch taps its knuckle against siding and then forgets the thought. Your own breath finds the pace of slow waves curling and unrolling on a quiet beach, leaving lace on the dark sand, gathering again, returning. The page of the sky waits where we left it, the ink not yet dry, the edges cool under the hand. For a half minute, nothing needs to happen. The instruments will be ready when we are. How do such visitors earn their passports? By arithmetic, mostly. The curve of a path around the sun can be an ellipse, a parabola, or something wider. And when it is wider, when the number we call eccentricity rises above one even after we account for the nudges of the planets, we call the traveller interstellar. The first shard wore that badge, not because it felt strange to us, though it did, but because its speed and slope said it would never return. The second wore it because, even with all our giant planets tugging, it rushed through on a line that would not close. Surveys netted them both, wide-field eyes sweeping the sky night after night, picking up points that moved a little too fast, a little too oddly, to be bound to our family. Then smaller nets came out to study the catch, and in that exchange, broad search, narrow look, we grew a little better at spotting the footprints of other neighborhoods in our dust. When you step back from the numbers, the feeling is simple. We live by sea lanes, and sometimes a ship from a far coast appears in our channel, leaving a long, slow wake. The surveys matter because they teach us cadence. Some, like the tall eyes on volcanic islands, walk the same strips of sky each clear night, and teach computers to recognize a point that has shifted just enough between exposures to be alive. Others, on desert mountains, sweep in different patterns, passing their finds to a network that compares, computes, and returns. A first guess at a path before the night has cooled. That handoff is a symphony played quietly. Alert notes travelling, small mirrors turning, larger ones waking. The whole system built to catch motion at the edge of noise and share it, so no single hill must see everything alone. Our two visitors threaded that web in different moods, one faint and spiky, one bright and generous, and the web held them both. It will hold the next. and the next. Humility, then, is the compass that keeps the chart honest. The shard that felt a gentle push without a visible breath may yet teach us a chemistry we had not expected to be efficient in sunlight, or a geometry of surfaces that focuses pressure in ways our models have not favoured, or a porosity that lets photons do more than we thought. The dusty traveller that looked so textbook may still hide unusual ratios, or leave fragments that age into something we have not guessed, or tell us about the nursery that sent it, by the way its grains scatter light and the way its ices let go. Between them, they remind us that the word interstellar is a beginning, not a conclusion, and that beyond the mathematics of a wide path lies the human task of listening long enough to tell the difference between the strange and the merely new, because the sea is large and our harbour small, and the wakes that pass our piers are many even when the night is quiet, and patience is how we learn which ones to follow with our eyes as they fade seaward, and which to let go with a nod and a small, grateful wish for their journey. Put your mind's eye close to the surface of a very slow mountain. The light here is thin, as if the sun were a lantern 3 valleys away, and yet this mountain glows with its own pale breath. Its slopes are not rock, but ancient ice, pressed and dusted, stitched with darker seams that remember the cold of their making. Compared to the pebbles and boulders we often meet, this body is vast, a small city's width, a geography unto itself, turning so slowly that you feel the turn more than see it. I think of it as a hill that learned to travel, carrying winter inside. Around it drifts a faint envelope, a hush of particles and vapours that only wake when warmed. All of this is happening far from any warmth we would call comfortable. And still, across that distance, sunlight finds a way to write its name on the ice. We first met this traveller in old photographs. Years of wide-field survey images, made for another purpose, were reread with fresh questions, and in them a moving point declared itself. The dark energy survey had been sweeping deep fields for cosmology, and within those frames a dot shifted, night to night, by just enough to be alive, rather than fixed. The finders checked their math, traced the slow thread through the stack of seasons, and sent word to the clearinghouses that keep our sky's traffic in order. A provisional label became a name with history inside it, acknowledging the patient team who sifted the archive and the tradition that catalogues wanderers. From there, astronomers of every scale turned gentle mirrors toward the path, adding measurements, sharpening the ephemeris, and beginning the long, careful habit of watching. A traveller, long anonymous, had entered the ledger. Size is a shy property at this distance, because coma blurs and flatters. To weigh the central body, you first peel back that soft haze with models that ask what fraction of the light is dust and what is core, and then you let a sharper eye try to separate those contributions in practice. With spaceborne optics, the halo can be measured and subtracted, leaving a residual that matches a compact source. From that, with care about albedo and phase, you estimate how wide the hard heart must be to shine as it does. The answer that emerged was startling in its calmness. On the order of 120 kilometers across, give or take the usual bracket of uncertainty, a nucleus more massive and more spacious than any cometary heart we have characterized this well before. Not a world, no, but no mere shard. A mountain, as promised by the numbers, wearing its own weather of dust and frost. Think of its road inwards not as a plunge, but as a long walk. Even now, it travels in realms where the sun is a pale coin, and the days are the colour of late afternoon. Its path is an airy ellipse that will never pass within Saturn's orbit, levelling out around a closest approach near 11 astronomical units, a rendezvous due in the calendar pages of 2031, well beyond the realm of the inner planets. A date circled not for drama, but for the simple satisfaction of meeting a schedule we can trust, because the equations that govern these turns are kind and old and patient, and because we will have time to arrange our instruments like chairs at a window, ready to watch without hurry, as the traveller takes that softest of bends and begins to drift away again into the quiet. The long arithmetic of its motion is a comfort. The numbers breathe evenly. What surprised many of us was not only the size, but the evidence of breath so far from the stove. In frames taken at distances where most comets would still be asleep, this one wore a visible veil, a faint coma that thickened and thinned as geometry and warming changed. The brightness curve rose just enough to suggest that some volatile species, those that do not need much coaxing, were leaving the surface, lifting grains, and drawing a thin atmosphere around the rock-ice mix. You could see it in the way the central light was a little too fat to be a bare point, in the way the outer halo changed with the angle of the sun, in the way deep stacks hinted at structure, where a perfect sphere would only blur. It was a quiet signal, but it stayed when we asked it to repeat itself, and over weeks and months it wrote a message we could read without squinting. Words matter here, because names carry expectations. On paper, you will see this object kept with the comets, and the choice is practical. It shows coma. It responds to sunlight with small outflows. Its spectrum matches families we know, and its orbit, though vast, wears the same grammar. Comet-like is a useful phrase when we mean the behaviour and not an oath about every detail. It allows us to talk clearly about jets, about dust, about production rates, about the way outgassing can add the faintest of forces to a path, and the faintest of spins to a body too large to pay much heed to them. It also leaves room for more learning. Label in place, we still ask what blends of ice live inside, what textures focus a jet, what layer cakes of crust and voids remember the long cold, and how a nucleus of this size parcels its heat. In days that last so long, the word day feels like poetry. The name opens a door rather than closing one. Scale is the part you feel last, and then cannot forget. Imagine standing at the foot of that ice mountain and laying your hand on a sloped wall that has never known rain. The dust under your glove is talc fine, the grains sunburnt on their edges, the cavities between pebbles as black as a closed eye. The horizon is near because the world is small, and yet this small world would fill your whole day to walk halfway around. Overhead, the sun is a small lamp, but it is enough, and the surface answers in a very slow language. Microns lifting, faint streams tracing arcs a child could step across in one stride, a snow so old it has forgotten winter and learned only stillness. The mountain keeps everything unhurried. Its slow shadow turns, the faint envelope glows, and then, like colours washing from a page at dusk, the scene thins to a quiet grey and slips away. Tonight's forecast for the far cold is clear and faint. Sunlight arrives there, like a polite guest, unhurried at the door, and the door opens only a little. What stirs? stirs gently. Think of a shelf of ices arranged by shyness. Water at the back, unwilling to leave its chair until the stove is close. Then carbon dioxide, who will rise to go if the room is merely cool. And nearest the threshold, carbon monoxide, already standing, eager to step out at the slightest warmth. That is the sublimation ladder, a quiet order that turns distance into chemistry. Out where a great nucleus keeps its own winter, the pale vapor we see is not the steam of boiling water, but the faint breath of those more volatile guests. They seep from pores, they nudge grains, they carry dust into a slow halo. It is not dramatic. It is continuous, the way a kettle hums before it boils. Beyond the orbit of Saturn, this is how a body breathes. The sun is too far to rouse water ice, but CO and CO2 can lift themselves, and a little cargo besides. In that regime, the coma is a whisper rather than a shout, yet a whisper repeated over many hours grows audible. Observers learn to listen by watching the profile of light around the center. If it fattens beyond the instrument's point-spread shape, if the outer slope softens into a warmer kind of decline, if the brightness at fixed aperture grows with the smallest turn inward, the message is plain enough. The pale vapor builds and thins with geometry, as daylit patches come into view and then roll away. Some nights the envelope looks almost round, on others it seems faintly lopsided, which is what you expect when a turning world with patchy pores greets a slanting sun. Quiet drivers make quiet weather. Photometry is our stethoscope for this slow breath. We place apertures like rings on a pond and measure how the water brightens toward the splash, then compare across nights and filters. If the inner ring swells while the outer holds steady, a transient jet may have flared and faded. If all rings rise together, the driver may be a broad face of the nucleus turning into morning. Colors shift too. A slightly redder hue can betray dust, dominance, while bluer light in the near UV hints at gas. None of this is decisive by itself, which is why we collect it patiently and pair it with spectra when we can. On an object this far, even tiny changes matter. A tenth of a magnitude here, a small excess there, and the story coheres. A large, slow body, exhaling with CO or CO2, sharing a little of its cold with space, and teaching us that even at the edge of warmth, chemistry moves. The room falls into a hush, as if someone dimmed a lamp. A cooling fan hums from another table. Outside, the air is dry and thin, and a low insect whir passes the window and then is gone. For a minute, let the numbers rest and the breath find its easy measure. The picture we are building does not bruise if we put it down gently. When we speak of production rates this far out, we speak softly. The numbers, where measured, are small in the absolute and large in their significance. Trickles of CO or CO2 that nevertheless loft visible dust. Mass loss that would be lost in the rounding nearer the sun, but here draws a real, if tenuous, atmosphere around the nucleus. Instruments that can separate gas lines from the continuum. Millimeter arrays for CO, infrared bands for the blend of CO2 and CO, give us ranges rather than exactitudes, because geometry hides some vents and reveals others, and because the nucleus turns. A rate that seems modest on Tuesday can look twice as strong by Saturday, not because the ice has changed its mind, but because a bright patch has rolled into daylight. We learn to think in envelopes, not points. The pale vapor goes on, faithful to its own clock. Dust is the handwriting the gas leaves behind. Grains lifted by gentle flow rise slowly, so they linger near the source and thicken the inner halo, while the smallest motes drift farther and write a faint skirt at the edge of the field. In the far cold, speeds are low. Even a millimeter-sized grain can hover for long minutes before gravity, and the thin push of light settle the argument. That mix shapes the look, a core that seems a little overbright at small radii, a shoulder where the profile bends, and then a long shallow tail where the tiniest dust rides away. If a vent is narrow, the pattern will carry a hint of direction. If it is broad or many vents speak at once, the field looks almost symmetric. Either way, the coma is a record of what the gas chose to carry and what it left behind. We read it, line by slow line. Underneath, heat moves with a deliberation that suits a mountain. The skin of the nucleus feels day and night, but only to a depth of centimeters. Below that, the news arrives late. Thermal inertia, the measure of how stubbornly a material changes temperature, keeps yesterday's warmth from fleeing and tomorrow's from arriving too fast. So vents may lag the sun by hours, or even by a gentle fraction of a rotation. On a body this large, rotations can be long, and the seasonal tilt can keep one hemisphere in a permanent slant of dawn while the other waits in a pale afternoon. In such lighting, a jet that seems steady may simply be slow to answer, and a lull may be the echo of last week's night. The result is a breath with memory. Today's pale vapor is partly yesterday's, and the map of sources changes as softly as shade moving across a porch. Questions remain, and they give the watching its purpose. Is carbon monoxide the main driver here, with carbon dioxide as a partner, or do the roles trade places as the path bends and the sun climbs a fraction higher? Are there trace species, ammonia among them, that join the outflow at detectable levels, or do they hide below thresholds until the light grows stronger? How large are the grains at the start, and how quickly do they crumble into smaller sizes as they collide and warm? What does the nucleus keep in reserve beneath its stitched crust, and how will that reserve answer when it reaches the calendar pages we have marked? We can ask without hurrying the reply. For tonight, we set the pen down, feel the chest rise and fall, and let the breath settle where it is. The pale vapor goes on, and we'll be here to listen. Lay your palm on the face of an old clock. Feel the slow hand move under the glass, not rushed, not stalled, only faithful to its circle. That is the mood for orbits. A body begins far out, falls inward, and then, if it is not bound, it glides away. If it is bound, it loops and returns. Our giant traveller follows a wide ellipse that never tightens enough to cross the lanes of the bright planets we know well. Kepler's laws describe this without strain, areas swept in equal times, periods that lengthen with distance, speeds that slacken as the path climbs. The numbers carry a calm. The closer you are to the sun, the quicker you must move. The farther you are, the more the clock slows. We can trust this rhythm. It has been true for every stone and snowball we have watched since numbers learned how to behave. When you see an orbit quoted, you are seeing a model of where a body will be, not a decree. The model can be written from two vantage points. In heliocentric elements, the sun sits at the center, and everything else is measured around it, as if the stage lights were pinned to a fixed ceiling. In barycentric elements, the center of mass of the whole solar system takes that place, a point that wobbles, because the planets tug on the sun as much as the sun tugs on them. A quiet dance that matters more for wide, slow travelers than for small, quick ones. For a distant comet or comet-like object, that barycentric view often gives a steadier picture of the long road, because it averages out the little shoves from giant planets that would otherwise make the elements fidget. Either way, we are reading the same clock, just from different chairs. The headline numbers are simple enough to hold. Closest approach comes in the calendar pages of 2031, and even then the distance remains about 11 astronomical units, outside the broad ring where Saturn patrols. Saturn's mean distance is near 9.5 units. Our travellers nearest will be farther. No crossing, no rendezvous, only a respectful passing in the cold. This matters for both safety and spectacle. Safety, because there is no near miss to fret over. Spectacle, because bodies glow more fiercely when they fall deep into the sun's warm light, and this one will not. Instead, we will watch the slow increase that distance alone can buy. The way frost that lies in shade will steam a little when the sun slants lower. The way a window brightens when morning turns its face a fraction toward it. A page turned, not a bell rung. Watching has its own geometry. The sky is not a dome, but a moving page, and your chance to see a faint guest depends on where it stands on that page when your night arrives. We check solar elongation, the angle between the sun and the object from our point of view, because large elongations keep the guest away from evening glare. We check altitude at twilight and midnight, because clear air is a better lens than thick atmosphere. We check whether the moon will wash the field with chalk or leave it ink black. And we mark the weeks when the object sits high enough at a dark hour to reward a drive and a thermos. A season may offer two such windows, one before dawn and one after dusk, and each will have its better nights and its worse ones. So we place them on a calendar the way a reader slips quiet bookmarks into a long book, returning when the room is kind. This is a slow sport, and the slowness suits it. The longest sentence of the night may simply be the arc the faint guest writes, while we whisper through a stack of small exposures and let the earth turn under our feet. The stars wheel behind the mount, and the numbers for time, angle, and air steadiness jot themselves in the margin while the kettle cools without complaint. Brightness is its own tide. For comets and comet-like bodies, the light we measure obeys two simple pulls: the distance to the sun, which governs how much energy is available to throw dust and gas into the light, and the distance to us, which decides how that light spreads before it reaches our mirrors. There is also the phase angle, the angle Sun, object, Earth, which is small for distant travellers and keeps the reflected light steady, without the dramatic crescents we see in the inner system. Observers wrap these ideas into a rule of thumb. As the object moves inward, it brightens by a predictable amount from a distance alone, and if activity increases, the extra dust and gas can amplify that rise. The curve is not a drumbeat, but a tide chart. It lets us guess which months will be kind to small telescopes, and which will ask for larger glass. The tide will never crash. It will lap, higher on the shore. Expectations, then, can be kind and clear. Without a dive into the inner system, we do not foresee fireworks. With a nucleus this large, we also do not expect a jittery path that slews under its own breath the way a pebble might. And in that blend of scale and distance lies a particular beauty, because what we'll get instead is the honest behavior of a massive, cold body answering a mild sun with a measured exhale, which means our task is not to brace for spectacle, but to prepare for steadiness, to gather enough nights to see small changes that would be washed out in a faster story, and to accept that the best we can bring to the ledger will be patience, calibration, and the comfort of numbers that tighten gently, rather than leap. If a brief outburst arrives, it will be interesting and likely modest. If none comes, the watch will still be rich. The page will fill in either way. The calendar has room for us to be human. We can mark the pre-dawn windows when autumn tilts the object high before sunrise, and the evening runs when spring lifts it into a dark sector after dinner. We can plan the image sequences we'll repeat, short exposures to catch profile shapes, longer ones to pull a tail's edge out of the grey. We can decide which filters to carry to tease gas from dust. We can gather friends for a coordinated weekend in which 4 small telescopes make one large logbook. And we can give ourselves permission to rest when weather says no, because the orbit is not a one-night promise, but a years-long invitation, and even on weeks we miss. The slow hand moves, the page waits, and the ledger welcomes the next line as if it had been meant for that spot all along. Turn the page with me. Let the paper whisper. The watch goes on. Imagine 2 instruments sharing a stage. One is a piccolo, bright and quick. The other is a contrabass, tall enough to cast its own weather, drawing a deep note that settles the whole hall. A small comet is the piccolo, a pinprick of ice that a narrow jet can push off course, its light body answering nimbly to every burst of vapour. A giant nucleus is the contrabass, massive, slow to start, slow to stop, and hard not to hear once it speaks. Force is only half the story. Mass is the other, and momentum is the bargain they strike. Give the same little push to both, and the piccolo will dart while the boss only leans. Our traveller is the base. It breathes, yes, but the breath moves a mountain's worth of sleep. The deep note holds. Jets decide how the push is delivered. Some vents are like open windows, throwing a wide fan of gas and dust that spreads the effort over angles. Some are more like nozzles, narrow and clean, where flow stays collimated, and the momentum has a direction you can point to with a finger. The narrower the plume, the more efficiently it acts as a thruster. Collimation also changes with distance and time. Grains load the flow and widen it. Sunlight turns a faucet up or down. Rotation drags the nozzle across the day. A focused jet on a small body can write a crisp kink into its path. The same jet on a giant will still write, but the line is faint and long. In the stacked frames, the signature is not a jolt, but a slowly evolving offset that ephemerides learn to include, the way a map maker adds a quiet bend to a river after walking the bank twice. Thrust also twists. Where there is an offset between a jet and the centre of mass, torque appears, and spin begins to answer. Picture a garden hose held off-centre. The water's push tries to turn your wrist. On a small nucleus, spins can wander by minutes or hours over a season. On a very large one, the change is measured in months, or not at all without a sharp event. The inertia of a deep, heavy core stores steadiness the way a flywheel stores calm. Still, even a flywheel can be coached, and a persistent jet will talk to the spin state until both compromise. a slight change in period, a nudge to the pole, a new balance between daylit sources and night. If the deep note is the baseline, talk writes a quiet harmony above it, slow to start, slow to fade, but present enough to matter when you listen long. Dust tells on the gas. A plume rich in grains steals energy from the flow, adds weight to the rising column, and returns some of the push to the surface as falling grit. The dust-to-gas ratio is the knob that sets how far the jet's momentum travels before it is spent, and therefore how much of the gas's will reaches the orbit or the spin. When the mix is dust-heavy, the coma swells, but the thruster weakens. When the mix is gas-rich, the coma can look thinner while the push is cleaner. Grain size matters too. Large grains are stubborn ballast. Small grains ride light and carry the jet story downwind before the sun's pressure takes ownership and writes the long tail. In a giant's gravity, more of the heavy stuff falls back, frosting slopes and muffling cracks. That recycling cushions the system. The deep note prefers legato to staccato. This is why pebbles wander more. The smallest comets we track often carry non-gravitational signatures that you can feel in the fit. Tiny but undeniable accelerations along and across their paths as daylit faces exhale. Some spin up or down, enough to change how their light curves breathe. Faint outbursts can move a schedule by hours. In extreme cases, a fragment breaks away and the remainder sails on with a new tilt and a new tempo. The physics is the same everywhere: sunlight, ice, vapor, dust. But the consequences scale with mass like weather scales with ocean. On a lake, a breeze corrugates the whole surface. On a sea, the same breeze only stipples a bay. Our mountain of ice is a sea. The breeze is felt, marked, and modelled, but it does not hurl the basin against its shore. The contrabass listens, adjusts, and keeps time. Models help us hear changes we cannot see. When astronomers describe non-gravitational effects, they do it with a small family of numbers that stand in, for thrust, along, sideways to, and perpendicular to the orbit, each multiplied by a gentle function of distance that mimics how ice wakes with light. Fit those numbers to months of positions, and you give the equations a memory of breath. For a large nucleus, those parameters should be small, sometimes indistinguishable from zero, for weeks at a time, then rising into view when geometry and activity align. Limitations remain. We rarely know the true pole. We rarely know where the strongest vents live. We never know the crust's porosity well enough to forecast its leaks. So the models act like good metronomes, steady, honest, and willing to be reset as the score evolves. They do not promise fireworks. They promise that, if the beat shifts, we will hear it. In that promise is comfort. A heavy traveller does not ignore physics. It simply answers with decorum. If a temporary surge arrives near closest approach, the path will kink by less than a whisper on the sky. The spin may budge by a breath. The coma may thicken and then thin. Observers will notice, because they have built the habit of noticing, not because the world lurches. We will fold the new numbers into the ledger and watch the residuals settle back toward quiet. The satisfaction is particular, like measuring the tide climbing a step on the breakwater and seeing that it reaches exactly halfway to the chalk mark you left last month. The deep note continues, steady under the melody, holding the room together while small voices come and go. And somewhere beyond the dunes, A long wave reaches the sand and lowers its white edge into hush. You stand with me on a small patch of dark, and the neighborhood is larger than the map. Above us, professional mirrors sweep like patient streetlights. Around us, backyards and balconies bloom into tiny observatories after dinner. We are all writing in the same shared notebook, page by page, line by careful line. Your breath slows to the pace of the mount's hum. The finderscope makes its small circle. Somewhere a gate clicks, and the sky feels like a quiet sidewalk we patrol together, nodding as we pass. In this watch, expertise is a spectrum, and generosity is the glue. What one mirror discovers, another measures. What one pair of hands stacks, another cross-checks. The ledger is communal, and the handwriting varies, but the story is one. Across the ocean and above it, survey systems keep the long beat. Wide-field arrays, twin eyes on volcanic ridges and desert summits, scan strip after strip, comparing tonight against last week, last month, last year, and asking the simplest question: which points have moved? When a pixel strays by just enough, software nudges a flag upright. A queue forms, a first orbit is sketched, a notice goes out. Sometimes the alert speaks of a new comet, sometimes of a faint suspect that might resolve into a coma with help. These nets are broad on purpose. They do not aim to finish the story, they aim to start it. And that is where you and I and 1,000 quiet setups on porches and pastures come in. We listen for those flags like distant bells. When an alert rings, the neighborhood wakes. A message lands in an inbox, a fresh line appears on a confirmation page, a circular posts with a provisional path and a plea for more eyes. Observers check their weather and their calendars. Someone in one time zone has dusk as another has dawn. Someone has a narrowband filter that might tease gas from dust. Someone else has a small, fast lens that can drink a wide field and fix the geometry. The first replies are often simple. Positions with honest uncertainties, times stamped in UTC, seeing and transparency in the notes. Then come deeper looks, stacks locked to the wanderer, profiles measured in concentric rings, gentle stretches that lift a whisper without inventing a word. The shared notebook thickens. It begins to look like a book. Discipline makes the pages legible. You center your alignment on the faint heart rather than the steady stars, because truth lives in the traveler. Calibration frames ride alongside the photons from the sky, so that dark current and dust are partners you can subtract rather than rumors you must fear. You keep exposures short enough that the comet's drift does not blur the core within each single frame. You stack many of them until the signal sits up. When you stretch, you stop before the noise shouts. When you sharpen, you show your mask and your radius. If you try a rotational gradient or an unsharp mask, you write down the angles and the widths you chose, and you try a cousin method to see if the feature survives baptism by a different fire. Only then do you let a phrase like may show into the margin. Reports do not vanish into the air. They join a river with banks. The Minor Planet Center collects positions and times in formats that other hands can read, and from those, orbit solvers refine the path. If photometry is your gift, you submit magnitudes with catalog names and apertures so that someone else can compare like with like. If you have a small observatory code, you use it. If not, a mentor helps you learn how to earn one. The point is not certification for its own sake. The point is that the shared notebook needs neat lines and consistent rulers if the story is to be useful a year from now, when memories fade but numbers remain. Each new reduction is a stitch that holds the fabric against time. Each modest measurement is a thread in the larger seam. There are pitfalls, and because we care about the notebook, we talk about them out loud. Moonlight thickens the sky background and hides the shoulders of a profile. Thin cloud writes gradients that masquerade as tails. Bad flats carve rings into halos that look like physics until you blink and remember dust. Reference stars can be misbehaving variables. Catalog 0 points can shift between surveys. A hot pixel can imitate a jet if it sits where your mask is thinnest. None of this is shameful. It is simply the weather inside the data. The cure is transparency. Show your work, confess your doubts, repeat the measurement with a slightly different hand, and invite another pair of eyes. In that generosity, the notebook becomes trustworthy. In that trust, small pages become a map. Ethics travel with the optics. We give credit upstream to the surveys that rang the bell, and downstream to the amateurs who caught the first subtle change and wrote it down. We resist the urge to dramatize. We replace certainty with clarity. We avoid announcing a discovery when what we have is a promising hint. If a frame from a friend shows a feature, we ask before we share. If a result turns out to be a processing echo, we say so plainly and thank the person who caught it. The code of this neighborhood is simple. Accuracy over applause, care over speed, community over pride. In a world that often rewards noise, the quiet currency here is trust. Spend it carefully, earn it slowly. The ledger will remember. Pause with me in the middle of this night. The mount ticks like a cricket with perfect timing. A dog 2 streets over gives a single bark and decides there is no case to pursue. Grass holds beads of dew that cool your wrist when you brush them. The cable from the camera swings an inch in a breeze that smells faintly of watered earth. Far away, a freight train lowers its horn, 2 longs and a soft short, and then the sound slides off the fields and leaves only the tiny fan in the camera body and the feeling that the whole town is asleep except for a handful of steady watchers, each at a small station, each turning a page in the same shared notebook, each writing a careful line that will matter in the morning. The next day, the river of reports widens. A new circular cites your times, alongside a dozen others. The orbit tightens. The predicted path shifts by a sliver no eye can see, but the numbers can. Someone posts a comparison of profiles from 3 small telescopes and 1 large one, and the curves agree within their errors. Another observer reconstructs your stack from your raw frames and lands within a fraction of a magnitude of your value. You return the favor and find the same. The shared notebook has margins now, room for questions, room for next steps, room for a sketch of where to look next week, when the geometry opens by 5 degrees and the object rides at a kinder hour. This is how a neighborhood stays safe, by writing things down together. The lantern at the end of the block burns a little steadier. Then someone reaches up, cups the flame, and lets it go out for the night. The watch will resume at dusk. The page waits. Definitions are tools. They sit on the bench, clean-edged, waiting for the right job. Comet, asteroid, interstellar. Each word is a handle we can grip without squeezing. Tonight, we lay the tools out in a neat row and choose with care. not to win a debate, but to keep the work gentle and true. Names are not trophies. Names are labels on drawers. When the light is low and hands are tired, clean labels save effort. They also slow our pulse. A small body's life on paper begins with a provisional tag. For comets, that tag starts with a letter: C for long period, P for periodic, sometimes D for lost or disintegrated, followed by the year and a code for discovery week, then a sequence letter and number. Asteroids receive a similar provisional string that later becomes a number and a name once the orbit is secured. If an object proves to have come from beyond our Sun's family, its draw is different. The Minor Planet Center assigns the I series, Interstellar, numbered in order of confirmation. That is how 1i entered the catalogue in 2017, and 2i Borisov in 2019, each with the discoverer's chosen proper name attached. The labels look simple because the homework behind them was hard. Simplicity is a courtesy paid after the fact. What earns that I? Not rumour, not a single night's point, but a consistent path that stays hyperbolic when you model it from the solar system's true centre of mass and add in the tug of planets. Observers supply astrometry across an arc long enough to tame outliers. Orbit solvers fit the data. Uncertainties shrink. Alternative bound solutions fall away. And the curve that remains says, softly but firmly, this traveller is not returning. The same caution that keeps us from overclaiming a jet keeps us from overclaiming a passport. We prefer many nights to one, many telescopes to one, and an orbit that survives new data, like a well-made chair survives new weight. Only then does a provisional tag become a clean-edged I with a number. Data sufficiency is a living thing, not a line in ink. There are comets whose eccentricities hover near one, nudged by measurement noise or by faint jets, so that early fits wander on either side of the boundary between bound and unbound. A week later, with twice the arc, a once hyperbolic solution relaxes toward an almost parabola that closes after all. Other times, an object that looked ordinary begins to show a persistent excess, an angle that refuses to bend back into the family, and the case grows stronger. This is why the drawer stays closed until the measurements have spoken more than once. Premature labels feel good in the moment and make a mess later. Clean edges come from waiting long enough to cut straight. Biases haunt our bins if we let them. Surveys are most sensitive to fast movers and to objects in certain swaths of sky. Press releases prefer clear villains and heroes. Our own eyes love novelty and will vote for new kind when old kind in a tricky pose would do. Interstellar objects are rare by any sane expectation, so a small tilt in our instruments or our attention can exaggerate their count. A long, faint arc with large errors will happily mimic a hyperbola if you let a few points lean the fit. A jet can fake curvature that gravity alone would not supply. The cure is not cynicism. It is calibration, replication, and the humility to admit that borderline cases are often just that, borderline. A clean bench means sweeping the shavings away before you declare a cut finished. The echo chamber adds its own resonance. A post with a striking frame or an excited caption can seed 100 summaries by morning, each a step further from the numbers. Confirmed walks faster than candidate. By the time the careful circular arrives with the sober phrase, maybe, half the room has already moved on. We cannot fix that rush, but we can build refuges from it. In those refuges, the slow pages where methods sit beside claims, the naming follows the evidence and not the other way around. A good habit is to bookmark those refuges and return there first. The ledger grows straighter when we do. Slow naming is not a flaw, it is a feature. Between 2017 and 2019, 2 travelers earned I. Since then, candidates have come and gone, some promising, some ordinary. Once the arc lengthened, none yet carried all the way to 3I as of the latest quiet updates. That empty slot is not a failure of curiosity, it is the shape of caution. If tomorrow brings a path that stays wide under every check, a clean-edge 3 will arrive, and it will arrive with the same unhurried dignity as the first 2 did. Until then, we benefit from the pause. The drawer is labelled but empty. It reminds us that not every suggestion deserves a stamp. Why does this matter to you here, in the hush? Because words guide attention, and attention guides breath. If we call a thing by a name that promises drama, we will chase the promise and miss the lesson. If we use the quieter name that fits the evidence, we will make a steadier ledger and a calmer night. The sky is generous with beauty, even when the labels are plain. A comet is enough, a candidate is enough. A careful maybe is sometimes the kindest word we have. So we go on with our tool bench tidy. We lift comet when the behavior fits. We lift asteroid when the surface stays quiet. We lift Interstellar only when the curve refuses every leash, and we set each tool down where we found it when the job is done. The drawer marked 3I is there if we need it. The hinges are oiled. The label waits with clean edges. And between now and the day it is filled, there will be many clear nights worth keeping, many faint halos to read, many small proofs to write in the ledger we share. Step with me to the doorway. The next page of sky has already turned. We will cross to it softly. Breathe with me, soft and slow. 4 in, 4 held, 6 out. Again. The room quiets. Our watch becomes a winter garden tended by small routines. Here the work is patient. We mark where the pale guest climbs at dusk, where it drops before dawn, how high it will stand when the air is clearest. Seasons turn that crank for us. In late months, the ecliptic leans one way, in early months, another, and the object's right ascension slides along a gentle rail, while its declination lifts or lowers the arc it writes across our roof lines. We plan around that tilt, the way a gardener learns which beds find sun in March and which in June. Some weeks gift us midnight culminations high enough to escape the soft soup near the horizon. Others ask for early risings or a stolen hour after dinner. The garden grows in these small decisions. The moon is our weather, even when clouds are gone. Around new moon, the sky is ink, and the halo of a distant comet loosens and spreads for us. Near first quarter and gibbous, the background swells, and faint shoulders vanish into chalk. We treat lunar phase like any other forecast. The week straddling new moon is for the subtle profile work, the inner rings, the gentle wings of a 1/row fall-off, the search for a soft kink that might betray a jet. The bright weeks are not a loss. They are good for the robust chores, updating astrometry, testing focus routines, building clean flats, and making longer exposures that reach the same signal-to-noise by sheer count. A notebook that survives winter has entries from bright weeks too. Moonlight is only a slower page, not a closed one. Filters are the gardener's tools hanging on their hooks. For a giant Farcold traveller, a red continuum band, An R, or R prime, often yields the calmest dust view, less rattled by blue sky glow and by small gas bands. A green G prime will answer with more sky and sometimes more gas, if there is any, which can be useful when you crave contrast between dust and faint emission. On bright nights, a long pass red or even near infrared can keep the background tame. Narrowband comet filters, those elegant little windows that isolate specific molecules, are treasures when the target is close and lively. Out here, they may come up mostly empty, but a disciplined experiment can still bracket what is absent. The rule that steadies the hand is simple. Pick 2 bands you can repeat, and repeat them. A consistent pair of colours across months tells a clearer story than a drawer full of one-night tests. Cadence is the watering schedule. Too often, and we trample our own beds. Too seldom, and we miss the bloom. For a traveller brightening by small degrees, a weekly look can be enough to keep the curve honest. Near a window of good geometry, 2 or 3 nights in a week can catch a short-lived change without asking for heroics. Each session, we gather a familiar set, dozens of short exposures that leave the core sharp in each frame. A second series slightly longer to pull the wings out, a paired pass in the twin filter. We stack the sets both ways, stars fixed for context, object fixed for truth. We let the calendar carry us, with patience for weather's vetoes and kindness for our own need to sleep. A garden watered on a rhythm forgives a missed day. What counts as an outburst here? Not rumour, not a single lucky frame. In our ledger, an outburst is a rise above the trend that multiple observers can catch within a day or two, generally by a few tenths of a magnitude or more, paired with a shape change. The inner profile fattens, a new shoulder appears, a short fan brightens at a particular position angle. The strongest cases echo across methods, independent stacks, different apertures, a second band that agrees, and a return to baseline after hours or days that rules out a slow seasonal drift. We write the time in universal time, the magnitude and aperture, the seeing, the lunar phase, the solar elongation, and any notes on clouds, wind, or dew. Then we wait for the same from another hill. If the chorus sings, we pencil in the word. If it does not, we mark the night as a lesson and keep going. Logging is the trellis that lets the vine climb. Begin with the date and UT window, then the site and instrument, then the filter and exposure recipe. Note the number of frames kept and the number discarded, the calibration sets used, and when they were made, the method of alignment, and the software version. For photometry, record the catalogue for comparison stars, the aperture radii, and the sky annulus, then the measured magnitudes with their scatter. If you like, add a simple dust proxy, how bright the inner halo is when scaled for distance, to compare month to month. None of this requires flourish. It requires handwriting someone else can read. A future you'll be, that someone else. A stranger across an ocean will be too. The vine finds the trellis and climbs. Let's step out into the winter garden together for a moment. The pre-roll hum is a low air tone, like wind on a bottle. Then the world goes quiet. Your breath shows in the window as a brief cloud, and then fades. Midway through the session, a second hush arrives, as if the snow itself were listening. A fox prints a straight line across the far lawn and vanishes. The sky has that particular depth it keeps for cold nights, a dark that feels physical and kind. Our traveller is a faint lint of light halfway up and a little east. The mount ticks. A kettle clicks once as it cools. We do the familiar things in the familiar order and let the garden be a garden. By spring, the angles will have shifted and the watch will feel different. The object will arc into a kinder hour. Perhaps the phase will swell or shrink. Perhaps the brightness will climb a little more. We will test a slightly longer exposure, then stand down if the core softens. We will add one new night filter to check a color without breaking our continuity. We will send our numbers and our doubts in the same envelope to the same friends. If a brief flare comes, we will meet it with gentle curiosity and the same calm recipe we use for ordinary nights. If no flare comes, we will be content to measure the slow tide and write its height in the ledger. Either way, our garden will have grown. Rows of dates, small leaves of numbers, a few flowers in the margins when we allowed ourselves a line about the fox, the frost, the smell of the air after dark. We close the gate softly. Starlight lingers on the path like frost that will not quite melt. A quiet truth first. I do not know how this story ends, and I am content with that. What I can promise is care. Care with what is seen, care with what is guessed, care with how both are carried to your pillow. It is a small confession spoken at the shoreline before dawn, when the tide has slipped back and the wet sand remembers waves that are no longer here. In that grey fog hangs low and honest. You see only as far as you can see, and the rest will wait. I like that kind of morning. It suits the sky. From months of keeping watch, a few things have settled like shells left by the low tide. A giant in the far cold wears a pale envelope that stirs without hurry. It is not a spectacle, it is a practice, a breath you hear only after you have listened for a while. Its road bends gently and keeps a respectful distance from the warm rooms where our planets live, and the calendar gives us time to prepare our chairs by the window. Far closer to us, a different guest has flashed a narrow, forward-leaning filament in some patient stacks, the sort of slender thread that asks for more nights and more hands to test it. None of these things demand a verdict tonight. They simply ask for good notes and unhurried eyes. What the watching has taught is simpler still. When you stack enough small, honest looks, patterns begin to stand without your help. When you invite another observer to rebuild your night from your raw frames, you both learn where truth sits and where habit sits. When you ask for a second instrument or a second geometry, and the feature you hoped to see either follows you or refuses to, you begin to feel which stories are sturdy and which were only fog in your own breath. This is not a defeat. It is the whole point. The ledger grows legible because you are willing to erase. Limits have a beauty that boasts do not. A telescope can only hold so much sky. A sensor can only cradle so many photons. A person can only keep so many midnights in a row before their eyes go sandy and their patience thins. And yet, within those edges, something graceful happens, because the limits themselves become guides, teaching you which handful of filters to trust, which cadence to keep, which claims deserve the word may, and which are strong enough to lean a little weight upon. And this discipline is not a fence so much as a path, a way through the dunes toward the waterline where the world is quieter, and the questions are kinder, and the work you carry feels like it fits in your hands without spilling. Ahead, The page turns softly. The far traveller will glide toward its meeting with a colder sun, breathing a little more as the angle of light grows kinder, and we will be ready with our modest instruments and our shared routine, adding lines to the ledger as the year rounds the corner and the season resets its lamps. In nearer fields, if that forward bright thread survives more geometry, we will learn its manners, whether it drifts, whether it sharpens, whether it belongs to a vent that faces day like a narrow window, or to a trick of processing we have not yet tamed. And the answer will not change the pleasure of the watch, because the pleasure is in the care itself, in the feeling that you and I and a scattered company of steady hands are listening to the same sky, and a finding that it speaks in complete sentences when we give it time. Gratitude is the undertow beneath all of this. For the first shard that taught us how a body can tumble and still carry a secret push without throwing dust into the room. For the second messenger who arrived dressed like a proper comet and reminded us that Interstellar can feel familiar rather than loud. For the surveys that sweep and the porches that confirm. For the quiet diligence of calibration frames and the modesty of may show when our hopes are louder than our numbers. For the way a large nucleus can be both immense and tender, breathing CO and CO2 into a halo so faint you have to blink to know you are seeing it at all. And yet, there it is, night after night, like tidewater seeping back between stones after the wave has passed. These are not decorations, they are the work. And now the fog thickens, the beach grows softer underfoot, the last gull scribbles a line across the pale sky, and is gone. Let the ledger close for tonight. Let the instruments cool and the cables fall still. The ocean has drawn a clean line at your feet and promised to return. The sky will do the same. Sleep finds you the way tide finds shore, without hurry, without fuss, and with a patience that refuses to fail. I will be here when you wake, and the page will be waiting, and the low tide will have left a few new shells to carry home in your pocket. We have walked a long, soft arc together, and now the room is quiet enough to hear the faint machinery of the night. A distant mountain of ice turns, exhaling gently in the far cold. Its path is steady, its meeting with a colder sun assured, and our calendars hold simple marks that will meet it there. Closer to home in the ledger, a forward-leaning filament has appeared in some patient stacks, the sort of delicate sign that asks for more nights, more friends, and the same careful may we've practiced. Between these two, one immense and slow, one faint and fleeting, your attention has done the kindest work it can do. It has listened without rush. If you wake later and wonder what was true here, know that the numbers are in good order. A nucleus measured by a steady eye in space. A gentle, closest approach far from the bright planets. A coma that builds on the breath of simple ices. A community that writes its methods beside its claims. None of that will vanish when you sleep. It will be there in the morning, untroubled by dreams. The ledger keeps its own watch. So let your breath shorten and slow. Let your hands grow warm and heavy. The page can close without a sound. Somewhere in a field or on a rooftop, a small red light still blinks and a mount still hums, and that is enough for tonight. Thank you for keeping company in the dark, for choosing quiet, for trusting the gentle pace of a sky that never hurries and never stops. May your rest be easy and long. May your dreams be wide and kind. Good night.